Sometimes leadership is chosen. Sometimes it's thrust upon you. And sometimes it's both. And I would say that that scenario typifies our next US president that we're looking at, Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ for short. LBJ wanted to be president. And in the pre-running primaries to the 1960 election, he went for the office. However, the Democratic Party chose JFK, and LBJ ended up serving as his vice president. Now, of course, that vice president would quickly become president with Kennedy's assassination. So this was a job that LBJ simultaneously wanted, but didn't necessarily expect to get, and certainly not in the circumstances that he did. And this is a little bit of an echo of a previous president we looked at, when we looked at Truman taking over from FDR. And I think there's some similarities between the two. The president they were taking over from was a very popular president, a very charismatic president, and trying to follow up on their performance with their service in general, but also in particular their inauguration speech was always going to be a tricky deal. And as I pointed to in the Truman evaluation, we saw that he didn't have that same natural charisma and communication that FDR did. Now, I don't think that's necessarily true for LBJ. LBJ actually has a very rich history of teaching, speaking, communicating. He taught public speaking and debating for a long time before he entered into politics. So he did have a certain style around him. It wasn't the same style as the Kennedy style we looked at in the previous video. So there is a clash of styles here. And then there is also taking on the mantle of, as we talked about last time, if it wasn't for I Have a Dream, one of JFK's speeches would probably be the speech of the 20th century. So that's always going to be big shoes to fill in terms of a communication sense. When Johnson comes in to do his first inauguration speech, just like Truman, he's actually already been serving as president. He's already been serving unelected, not quite as long as for Truman, just about 18 months or so by the time that he's doing his inauguration speech. So normally the speech is setting out what you're going to do. In this case, it's setting out what I'm going to continue to do or what I'm going to do next. And I would say that there is possibly one big advantage that LBJ has that would help him in terms of setting out what he's going to do. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act passes, and this is a monumental piece of legislation. Now, of course, limited in exactly how much it changed, but in terms of getting it through after all of the civil rights movement of people like Martin Luther King, for example. And many experts believe that actually if Kennedy had been president, this legislation wouldn't have gone through. LBJ had a rich history and relationship network in the United States Congress, in the United States Senate, and he was able to wheel and deal, whip the votes that allowed the legislation to be passed, which JFK, for all his charisma and all of his energy, possibly wouldn't have been able to do. So LBJ has got a really solid result on his CV resume already. He's going, look, I have delivered on this. Here's what I'm going to continue to deliver on. In terms of the election itself, by the time he finally comes around to election in 1964, he wins a landslide, 61% of the vote. And again, you remember last time where we talked about JFK only won by about 100,000 votes. So it was a very tightly contested election. This one was nowhere near. So when LBJ comes in to deliver this speech, he's sitting on some real precedent here. He's saying, look, I've already got something done. I've already got a big monumental piece of legislation passed. I've been elected with a huge mandate of the country. And with all that foundation, I don't think LBJ does as good as he could in this speech. And we'll explore this a little bit more. Considering LBJ has a big kind of history and is very comfortable in his style of delivery, I'm not so sure he executes this as well as he could in this speech. So I'm going to go into some of the reasons why I believe this when we watch this inauguration speech. There's certainly things that he is doing well, and I would say that overall he does a better job of setting himself out and differentiating himself than Truman did in terms of Truman trying to differentiate himself from FDR. I think LBJ is doing a better job of taking on the mantle and taking on the baton from JFK, but I still think there's some areas he could work on and improve. And that's what we're going to dive into in this analysis video. Just before we do, I'm going to do my legal disclaimer. All of the footage that I'm using is coming from CBS News. So I want to thank them for providing this footage. Also, I do not claim the rights to this footage at all. The use of this footage is for informational, educational purposes only. With all that jargon out the way, let's now look at LBJ's inauguration speech, 1965.
My fellow countrymen, on this occasion, the oath I have taken before you and before God is not mine alone, but ours together. We are.
I like how LBJ begins that. Not necessarily in terms of the word or voice, and I'll get into that more in this analysis, but there's just that little bit of eye contact there. So he actually looks to different parts of the audience and he holds the gaze. Now, of course, he's never going to be able to see one individual face, but giving the impression of giving that attention to you, giving that attention to you, giving that attention to you, it's drawing in the audience. And it's something that very comfortable speakers do, is to be able to just find someone in the audience and give them a little bit of attention. And this, I think, does come from LBJ's history in doing a lot of public speaking, debating, is learning how to engage the audience. So I like how he's starting off there in terms of that audience engagement. I think in terms of the word and voice, there's maybe some a little bit more we can go into. But again, I'm going to do that a lot later in the video.
They made a covenant with this land, conceived in justice, written in liberty, bound in union.
We've got our good old rule of three coming in there. And this rule of three, it sets up the structure for a lot of how LBJ speaks for probably the first half of his speech, maybe a little bit more. So this is quite far into the speech already. So to fill you in on some of the details, of course, you can go and watch the whole speech yourself. Click on the link in the description. So he uses the idea of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights as a foundation for what he's setting out in terms of his presidency. And that rule of three, it gives him the different categories. So he's talking about liberty, he's talking about justice, he's talking about union. And that creates the themes of the speech. So not only is it just a nice rule of three, okay, yeah, we've got three catchy phrases to come together. It then sets up the structure, and it's a little bit of a preview of what's to come. So we talked about in previous inauguration speech analyses, one technique is good, a synergy of techniques is even better. So he's not just using a rule of three to make those statements catchy. He's using that rule of three to anchor the structure of his speech. So we've got a nice introduction coming in there. It's coming in a little bit later than I would like to see. It's 3.5 minutes. I'd like to know what the speech is going to be about a little bit earlier than that. But again, these are things I'm going to talk about a little bit later in the video.
In a land of great wealth, families must not live in hopeless poverty. In a land rich in harvest, children just must not go hungry. In a land of healing miracles, neighbors must not suffer and die untended. In a great land of learning and scholars, Young people must be taught to read and write. For more than 30 years that I...
What we've got there is a use of anaphora. Anaphora is a phrase repeated at the start of successive statements. So we've got in a land, in a land, in a land, in a land. And that repetition, it draws our attention, it anchors the points. And as well as anaphora, we've also got that contrast. So in a land of plenty, people should not be hungry. In a land of scholars, children should be educated. So again, we're seeing a combination of techniques here. And this is where you can really make important points in your speech pop, is stacking techniques. Again, don't overcomplicate it and go, I'm going to use 3 alliterative, onomatopoeic metaphors to make my point stand out. No, that's not what I'm saying. But if you can combine them in a very smooth way. So what we've got there, so many of these speeches are about contrast. They're about, this is how things are, this is how things should be. So that contrast helps set out the stool and it shows a direction. What direction are we wanting to go in? So the anaphora here is making that phrase or this succession of phrases stand out, grab the attention, and the contrast is painting the picture of this is where we're going as a nation and this is where I'm taking you as a leader.
Thus, if as a nation there is much outside our control, as a people, no stranger is outside our hope.
That's just a line that I liked. It's not really a technique or anything. I just like that line. There is no stranger beyond our hope. I think it's a very sweet, soft line. And yeah, I just like it.
Think of our world as it looks from that rocket that's heading toward Mars. It is like a child's globe hanging in space. The continents stuck to its side like colored maps. We are all fellow passengers on a dot of Earth. And each of us, in the span of time, has really only a moment among our companions.
To give you a little bit of context, right at the beginning of the speech, LBJ talks about there is a rocket heading towards Mars. And here he makes a little callback to that rocket. And we've got a lovely piece of imagery here. When he's talking about looking at the world, it's a globe, like a child's globe, the colored mats, we're a little speck. You really get that image in your mind. And one of the most important things we can do as speakers is to create images in our audience's mind. Our brain is very visual. So much of our brain is dedicated to some kind of visual processing. And a lot of how we understand meaning and provide context in the world is through vision. When you create those images in the audience's mind, you allow them to better connect with the content of your words, because words are just a sound. You need to provide the full sensory experience. So they aren't just hearing your words, they're seeing your vision. So it's a lovely piece of imagery that comes in here. It's something we can really see clearly and boldly in our head. And it's maybe something we should have seen more of in this speech. And again, I know I keep on teasing about things I'm going to say later in the video, but I am going to talk about that later in the video.
We have discovered that every child who learns, and every man who finds work, and every sick body that's made whole, like a candle added to an altar, brightens the hope of all the faithful.
Again, lovely synergy of techniques here. We've got the repetition of every. The repetition draws the attention, makes those statements stand out a little bit more. And then again, there's that lovely piece of imagery there. The candles in the altar, the light that brings hope. And remember, hope was a word that was used a little bit early on. No stranger is beyond our hope. So there's almost like a little bit of a link and a callback to some other nice uses of language and some other nice imageries coming through there. So again, for exactly the same reasons, we're seeing those candles, aren't we? So it's a visual representation of the principle LBJ is trying to explain, that every person that we help is that little bit more light, that little bit more hope, that little bit more progress.
And abiding divisions which scar the Union for generations. Under this covenant of...
What we're seeing there is an example of how to use notes well. You can see LBJ is switching his notes, but then he still delivers the lines, scarring our Union. He makes sure he's got the correct next section of notes before he starts again. And he doesn't, or as we saw a more contemporary politician do, forgive me, forgive me, forgive me. He doesn't faff with his notes. He doesn't panic. He's very smooth, very measured, and he's confident in taking that pause, even when he's on television, even when he's in front of a nation, pausing to make sure he's in the right place with his notes before he continues. That's good composure. That's an example of how to use notes well.
Under this covenant of justice, liberty, and union, we have become a nation, prosperous, great, and mighty.
We have a matching of the rule of three there. Remember I said earlier that LBJ sets out the structure of the speech: liberty, justice, and union. It's like, okay, great. Those are the things that we're based on. Why is that good? Well, it's made us prosperous, great, and mighty. So again, we're seeing a combination here. We've got the pairing of rules of three, of these are the three foundations, and these are the three results. So again, a little bit of a synergy of techniques going on here and showing people the direction. This is where we are. This is where we're going.
It is the excitement of becoming, always becoming, trying, probing, falling, resting, and trying again, but always trying and always gaining.
You may have noticed so far in LBG's speech style, and you may be anticipating what I'm going to say later. In this speech, he's quite slow and stilted, and it's not that every speaker has to be fast and animated and energetic. He doesn't have to speak like JFK before him, but I have felt a distinct lack of flow and energy in a lot of the speech. And of course, this is something that I'm going to talk about in the kind of suggestions for improvement second part of this video. And the reason why I'm going to suggest it for improvement is because I've actually seen an improvement here. We are 16 minutes into a 22-minute speech, and you can go and watch this yourself. That is the first bit of real animation that I see from LBJ. We see the move, we see the hand movements, we see the fists, we see the come into the mic and really kind of vocalizing that point. So he can do it, but for so much of this speech, he doesn't do it. And that, I think, is a little bit of a frustration point for me, that it's fine to have a methodical, measured approach of speaking. A contemporary speaker like the Dalai Lama, for example. The Dalai Lama speaks in this very slow, methodical way. But he understands how to use that type of style. And I feel that LBJ should understand how to use his particular style as well. He's been speaking for long enough. He's been training people in speaking. And I can see the skills of speaking coming through. And I just think energetically in this speech, it did somewhat miss the mark a little bit. Just those little moments on those key statements just allow things to pop, and it just creates that little bit of variation and cadence where for a lot of the speech it's been quite monotonous and slow. So I thought there was some really great animation there, and I really wanted to see more of it in the speech, and I especially want to be seeing it way before the 16-minute mark of the speech. That type of energy and vigor needs to be coming in earlier, I think.
If we fail now, then we will have forgotten in abundance what we learned in hardship.
That's a nice line. Forget in abundance what we've learned in hardship. And what LBJ points to there is saying we've got a lot of things right over history. Like, we are moving in the right direction. It is a better time to live now than it was when our nation first started. However, we can't allow things being better to stop us from trying to grow and improve, because for a lot of our nation, things are not that much better, and that needs to change. So it's a really nice, it's a lovely line of optimism and temperance at the same time, of saying, look, okay, we've got a lot of optimism for what we're doing here, but let's not get complacent. Let's stay measured and let's stay focused. So getting a real nice blend. What you're always trying to do with an inauguration address is you're trying to paint an optimistic vision of the future, but give a pragmatic, practical path to that future. And it's always a fine tightrope to walk. We've seen some speeches that have been maybe a bit too pragmatic and not enough flair and excitement. And possibly we've seen a little bit of overindulgence on that optimism and idealism. And you could argue that JFK's speech, as good as it was, did lean a lot more into that aspect of things. So this type of line, that type of tightrope, finding the happy medium between the two, is a good use of language and a good line to come in as we're starting to get towards the end point of this speech.
That freedom asks more than it gives.
Again, here we've got another follow-up line to that abundance hardship line. Freedom asks more than it gives. So again, it's just providing that nuance and that clarity on, okay, freedom is great. Freedom is what our country is based on and founded on. However, with that freedom comes responsibility. And it's almost a little throwback to the famous line of, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. It's a little call out to saying, we're going to do things as a collective. You also need to do things as individuals. That in order to make things better, we need to all chip in. We all need to build, we all need to contribute to this idea of freedom. Because if we don't, and if we get complacent, and if we rest on our laurels, we no longer have that freedom that we so enjoy.
If we succeed, it will not be because of what we have, but it will be because of what we are. Not
like that line. I like the line and I like the delivery of it. Again, we've got some contrast here. We've got some direction of, this is what we need to do in order to get things done, not because of what we are. And I love the little turn, hold that part of the audience, but because of what we are. So yeah, it's a nice line. Again, it's really starting to build on these ideas. Again, we're getting into the end game of the speech. So really setting out, okay, this is what we've covered and this is where we're going. This is where we've been. This is what we're going to become. So using all of these lines to build that clarity, and then starting to build a little bit of the energy and animation. And as I said, I think there's some improvement to be done there, but there's these little moments in these types of lines where the language is good and the delivery is starting to become a little bit more pointed. So it is moving in the right direction, even if I think it's maybe been a little bit too slow and a little bit too little too late.
For this is what America is all about. It is the uncrossed desert and the unclimbed ridge. It is the star that is not reached and the harvest that's sleeping in the unclouded ground. Is our world gone?
We've got some imagery again there. What is America about? Now, he could just say America is about innovation and ambition. And those buzzwords sound nice, but they don't mean anything. We don't get a context. We don't get a vision with that. But when he says America is the uncrossed desert, America is the unclimbed ridge, what are we getting? Images. Images provide depth and substance to the words that you're saying. So we see the desert and we see the ridge and we go, I wonder what's on the other side of that desert. Let's be ambitious. I wonder how we can get to the top of that ridge. Let's be innovative. So you are demonstrating examples of those buzzwords, of those principles. So you are still saying, let's be ambitious. You're still saying, let's be innovative, but you aren't telling, you're showing. And that is one of the most powerful aspects of communication, both in written form and in spoken form. It's always better to show your audience what you mean rather than tell them what you mean. And that imagery is a great way of doing that in that part of the speech. Next up in the video, I'm going to offer some ideas and suggestions for how LBJ could have improved his speech. And I've been teasing already what some of those things might be. Just before we go into that, if you have a speech that you're working on right now, if you are trying to prepare yourself for an important moment of leadership and responsibility, just like LBJ was, then we can work together in one of my coaching programs. If you want to find out a little bit more about how coaching works, about how we can take your speeches and we can work on them in this same way, looking at what you're doing well, what's making you stand out as a speaker, and what parts can you refine and sharpen to make you stand out and make you more impactful. I've put the link to my LinkedIn profile in the video description. That's the best way to reach me. If you just send me a DM on LinkedIn, there we can talk a little bit more about what the coaching options are, find one that's right for you and your speaking, so we can prepare you for whatever platform you might be getting on, even if it's getting on the platform of the US Congress building for a presidential speech. After all, it's election year, so if any of the candidates need a little bit of work, I'm right here for you. Let's now look at how LBJ could have improved his inauguration speech.
That is the majesty and the meaning of this moment.
That's a lovely line. The majesty and the meaning of this moment. We've got that alliteration. We've got a little bit of a rule of three is there as well. But I think, okay, so this is 1 minute into the speech, and I think this really typifies what bothered me about this speech, shall we say, that LBJ knows how to speak. And a lot of his speech is quite well written. We've got some great lines. We were looking at them in the previous part of the video. It just lacked a little bit of that punch in some key moments. So that line, it's a lovely line, but it comes across in a quite understated way. The majesty and meaning of this moment. For me, that line should be, it's the majesty and the meaning of this moment. And you don't have to speak like that all the time. You don't have to have the variations in the voice all of the speech, because then it sounds a little bit strange. He can have that sort of slow, methodical style for his default speaking. But I think for key phrases such as that, there, in my opinion, should be more variation in that. The majesty and the meaning of this moment. Make that sound majestic. Make it sound meaningful. And for me, that just kind of sounds like all the other statements that he's saying. It just sounds like a benign statement. And for me, that's not a benign statement. For me, that's a really good statement. The content aspect, in terms of the crafting of that line, is great. The delivery aspect, room for improvement.
The next man to stand here will look out on a scene that is different from our own.
I find it very strange to be talking about the next president. I want to hear about the president now. I want to hear about what you're doing. I want to hear about the world that you're a part of. I don't want to hear about what the next person is doing and what they're a part of, because they might be a leader that I didn't vote for. And indeed, the next president is Richard Nixon. And there isn't too much crossover in terms of the voters who voted for LBJ and the voters who voted for Nixon. So I don't want to hear about the next guy who might be someone I didn't vote for. And if I'm watching this and I didn't vote for LBJ, then all I'm going to start thinking of is, oh, I can't wait till 4 years' time and we can vote for someone different. So I just think that's a very strange line to start, for us to start imagining someone else speaking to us. No, I want us to be with you speaking. I want to hear about what you're going to do. I want to hear about your vision for the future. I don't want to hear about someone else in that future. So I thought that was a very strange line to be coming in there.
Before this generation of Americans is finished, this enemy will not only retreat, it will be conquered.
He does get an applause for that line, and it's a nice line. But when I heard that line, I wrote down straight away in my notes, more fire. I felt, again, similar to the majesty meaning of the moment. That's an impactful statement. So leading into that, have your default, methodic, precise way of speaking. But I think for that moment, it's not only an enemy that will retreat, it's an enemy that will be conquered. That's how JFK would have delivered that line. And again, we don't want to draw comparisons here, but I do think that needs more energy. LBJ doesn't have to do it in a JFK way, but I think he has to do it in his way. And funnily enough, as I started to watch this speech more and more, I had never seen an LBJ speech. All I'd seen is his representation in pop culture. And one of the things that's kind of the myth of LBJ is this sort of like fiery hairdryer treatment that he did, that when he wanted someone to vote, he would go into their office and he would shout and scream at them to get them to fold and to push the vote the right way. And that's what I want to see in this moment. I know he can do it. Part of his myth and legend is he's famed for having that kind of just fiery, punchy communication. And I just wasn't seeing it in this speech. And I think that kind of line, it's a war analogy, isn't it? So let's see a little bit of that fight in that line. Not just retreat, they'll be conquered. Like, let's have some punch and let's have some energy. Now it gets the applause and it gets the clap because it's a nice line and you're supposed to clap the president when he says a nice line. But I feel that line could have been even more evocative. And instead of just the token applause, we could have had something more like a rousing applause, just with that little bit of refinement on that delivery.
What I said on that sorrowful day in November last year, I will lead and I will do the best I can.
That for me is a bit of a false end. So JFK, talk about a Freudian slip. LBJ, why do all presidents have three initials? FDR, LBJ, JFK. LBJ, at this point in the speech, he set out his stall. And I think at this moment, kind of touching upon a little bit of the elephant in the room and recognizing a little bit of actually why he's here. Now, of course, he has at this point been elected as president. So fair enough, he's won an election. But also, if he probably wouldn't be running in this election if it wasn't for the assassination of JFK. JFK would have been the 1964 presidential candidate, and he would have won it. Looking at how many people voted for LBJ, the same amount of people who voted for JFK probably. So JFK would have been the president in this situation, apart from such an iconic and emotive event. And I think LBJ does a really nice job of just touching upon that here. Doesn't doesn't make it a big part of his speech and doesn't draw endless comparisons between him and JFK, but just saying, look, in November last year is 1963, and he's speaking in 1965. So not quite last year, but just before. He says, I was thrust into this position and I said I'll do the best I can. Now I'm stepping into this position and my promise is the same. I'm going to do the best I can. Now, I think that could be a little bit punchy and have a little bit more conviction, but it's a nice touch. And that could be a nice place to end the speech. And certainly, if I just play the applause on a little bit more. It's kind of feel like an end of the speech. But oh, he hasn't gone back to his seat. Or has he still got more to say?
You must.
And he does. So I feel that's a bit of a false end. I think if LBJ is going to bring that up, he either needs to bring it up a little bit earlier and make it clear that this isn't an end point of the speech, or if he is bringing it in the end, I think some of the crafting of the words and the cadence of the speech, and again, I think this is where we're talking about LBJ's cadence, because he's speaking in that methodical way so often, it's hard to notice transition points. Whereas if you build up and build up and build up, and you get a little bit more pace and a little bit more energy, and then suddenly you stop, that's a clear demarcation point of this is what we're going to do, this is what we're going to do, and we're going to do it. Mic drop. Whereas this is what we're going to do, this is what we're going to do, this is what we're going to do. You kind of don't know if there's going to be another this is what we're going to do. So I think there's a little bit of a false ending there, a little bit of the word crafting just to make it not sound like such a final line, and a little bit of the energy as well of actually throughout the rest of the speech making it more clear when you have transition points, making it more clear when you get to key statements, so the audience will know whether this is a key statement or not. And I don't think the audience do know whether this is a key statement, and that's why there's a little bit of this false end that comes in there.
For who can judge this? Thy people, that is so great.
And there's the actual ending. And for me, that just felt really flat, and I didn't know what I was supposed to take from that last part. So the crafting, the energy, the false end about 30 seconds before, it felt really flat there for me. And I think that summarizes my main critique of this particular speech is we needed more fire and we needed more punch, not in all parts of the speech, but at certain parts of the speech. I think overall the speech was a little bit methodical, a little bit slow, and it needed things to kind of brighten it up. Now, we had some of those really nice uses of imagery that came in. I think I had about 3 examples where I went, okay, that's some really nice imagery. Well, let's get 10 examples. Let's make this a lot more visual and a lot more stimulating. We have some really kind of nice uses of language in there. Let's make that language pop. Let's make that language have a little bit of sparkle and energy and conviction to it. So I think LBJ had the ingredients for a good speech, and in fact, as a good speaker. I don't think LBJ is a bad speaker, but I think just the execution of this speech wasn't quite there. And I think what maybe frustrates me about that, I think the other speaker that I've kind of gone quite hard in was Truman's speech. And I thought Truman was also kind of flat and not particularly charismatic. But I don't think he had that in him, and that's okay. Not everyone is supposed to be a fantastic communicator. There's more than one way to lead. But I think what frustrates me about this speech is knowing LBJ's reputation, I think he had more in him than what we saw in this speech. So I think this speech isn't like a low ceiling of performance. I think it's an underperformance on a ceiling that was a little bit higher. And I think this is something that we always need to remember as speakers is we need to make sure we're performing at our ceiling or as close to our ceiling as we get. And I know I've certainly been in the position where I've done speeches and I've gone, like, that was all right, and I've got away with it being all right, but I didn't I didn't do my best. I didn't show up as I could have done. And doing that little bit of introspection to work out, well, why didn't I show up as well as I could have done? Was it a lack of practice? Was it a lack of feedback? Was it a lack of managing myself properly, like my sleep, my nutrition? Was it I listened to the wrong song? Was I checking social media before my speech when I should have been focusing and concentrated? So I think as a speaker, you've got to know what gets you into that zone of performance, because when you have a big opportunity, you don't want to underperform in that opportunity. When you're delivering a speech to the nation and it's your first speech as the elected leader, you don't want to underperform. You want to hit your ceiling. And if your ceiling isn't as high as other people, like, that's all right, but at least you've hit your ceiling. But I think for me, this was a speech that didn't hit its ceiling. And I think that's probably the biggest lesson to take away from that. Yes, there's all the kind of technical points I think that could be improved upon. But most of those technical points I think was just about LBJ getting more into that zone and really bringing the best of himself out in this speech. And so I don't think we quite saw the best of him in this speech. Make sure that your audience always sees the best of you in your speeches.